AGD and schedule, they don't operate in that same way. They're
Gotcha.
in a sense the inputs to your team rating.
Okay.
But the schedule, I mean, Highland Park played what I'll call, 3 goals stronger schedule than Westlake. But as you can see, Westlake had a 3 goal higher AGD and they ended up equal. So kind of back to Taylor's point earlier, like, you can play stronger competition and your record may not be there, but your schedule is going to go up, your AGD is going to drop a little bit, and then kind of vice versa. You can play the weaker opponents, your schedule is going to be lower, but you're going to have a higher AGD. Every team starts the season, and I'll even take it a step further with you guys. Every team actually, when we run the daily rankings, we're wiping everything out and running them from scratch every day.
No kidding.
And part of that is because of errors. If Highland Park, they played, I don't know. I know they travel out east, so let's say they played Gilman. Or Western Reserve, because I know Western Reserve has 2 teams in the system. But let's say they played Western Reserve and they accidentally entered it against their varsity team, B team, the first time. If we didn't wipe everything out, that game would kind of still have an impact on their future rating. So we actually wipe everything and start from scratch. Every day. I'll be honest, Texas is kind of our catalyst, if you will. You guys are the first state that starts, and you guys are the ones who start the travel. You start going to California, you start going to Florida, you start going to Colorado, and those are, when you talk national and regional scale, those are the games that start the tie-in, and Texas is really the catalyst for that. So on my end, I'm doing like mappings. Okay, these states have played each other. This state hasn't played outside the state. And back to Texas is always one of those that I'm connecting to other states. Like, all right, we got this interplay and, things like that. And so, back to really answering your question, everyone starts at 0 every week. And I'm not a mathematician by any means, but it's really a recursive mathematics. The 8-game mark is more early in the season, I'll say. When every team in the state has, 4 games or 6 games, as you're kind of working up to that 8-game mark, there can be some weird things early in the season. Once a majority of teams have started to hit that 8-game mark, I think that's when they really start to become accurate. And part of it, in a state like Texas that's so big, your Dallas teams need to play your Austin teams, and you gotta have enough to get that interplay. Right. But generally, if some teams are playing 10 games and some teams are playing 20 games, I think both of those are accurate because in a sense, every team has kind of reached that mark. We understand in high school athletics, with conference alignments, with divisions, those matchups aren't always even. And so we use a 10-goal max. We have a sportsmanship differential at that point. In essence, when teams are that far apart, the top team needs to win by 10 goals, put in the backups, develop your roster, and it's going to work out. When you start getting less than 10 goals, at some point you have to reward that lower ranked, weaker team for playing well against strong competition.
Absolutely.
And so that's why you kind of use that 10-goal max. And I know at times coaches are like, they won by 8 or 9. They're like, well, if I would have known that, I would have kept my starters in so we could have got to 10 and things like that. I'll be honest, I'm not on the ground. I don't know if that's always the case or if back to the lower ranked, lower rated team really outperformed and deserves credit for that game. But that's kind of where we do try to strike that right balance between what I'll call sportsmanship on the field, or sportsmanship, but also encouraging teams to foster player development, to develop the bottom half of the roster in some of those situations and things like that. Here's how I kind of think of head to head. In a big picture, our algorithm is kind of calculating a average performance rating. So it's not how your team performs at its best. It's not how your team performs at its worst. It's kind of that average. And
Right.
and so, when you get to the end of the season, and some of it's state geographic dependent, but a lot of teams have beaten someone rated ahead of them and lost to someone rated below them, and that's part of that average performance rating. And I often equate it to kind of like a matchup. Like, I may match up well against Troy's team, and for whatever reason we may be rated lower, but we have Troy's team's number. Doesn't mean we're better when you're looking at their whole body of work. But for whatever reason, our team can match up well against Troy's, and we beat them. And so that's often how I think of head to head. It's that big picture of, it's an average performance rating, not necessarily your best set of games or your worst set of games. It's somewhere in the middle. And then when you're referring to just one game, back to, was that team missing their starting goalie? Did they have 3 players suspended because they got caught at a party last week?
Right.
Whatever it is. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm better than Troy when I'm looking at the whole body of work. In that one game, yes, I was. And so that's kind of how I like to think of head to head. I just know from my discussions, some people think if I beat your team, I should always be rated ahead. And I understand the human nature aspect of that argument. But being around high school and youth sports long enough, I know there's other things at play, and that doesn't always mean that you're better than that team. And so it can be a tough one to try to explain to someone who's so set on my team beat your team, I should be rated ahead of you. But I'd like to think when you talk about like a whole body of work, and back to, it's not your best game or your worst game. It's, your average rating is going to fall somewhere in between. Don't get me wrong, ratings are always changing, but I like to think of, at the end of the season, teams have 15, 20 games. If you look at that rating, I like to think of that rating almost becomes the constant. It's staying within a point or something, by the end of the season. You're not really going to go from an 89 to an 85 all of a sudden, or an 89 to like a 92 all of a sudden. You're going to stay in that range. And to your point, the variables really become at that point your goal differential and schedule. The harder your schedule is, the lower your goal differential is going to be. I'm gonna hop back here real quick to answer Troy's question about kind of gaming the system.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I mean, is it possible that someone's finding a slight advantage here or there? I think maybe, but to me, it's a performance-based algorithm. Gaming the system means your team played well against good teams. And if you do that, that's obviously gonna, kind of help you from a, can you beat up on bad teams and get a higher rating? I mean, generally speaking, I would say that's not a good option. I think there's some win-based algorithms out there, RPI-based, that they reward those kind of wins against bad teams. I would say for the most part, our algorithm rewards teams who play well against strong competition, and strong competition is it's a moving point. It depends on where your team's at, if you will. If for Highland Park, strong competition may mean, you know, going outside the state and finding teams. For a team that's middle of the pack, Class B, Class C, that's playing teams that may be a couple points higher than you or something like that.
Right.
And so that's where I think that needle can move depending on where you fall in the kind of list. But ultimately, I really haven't ever seen a scenario where a team is truly gamed the system to the point where people are like questioning anything. Are teams potentially a spot or two higher than someone thinks they should be? Yeah, that happens, I think, almost every year. But is some team all of a sudden ranked in the top 5 that shouldn't even be, anywhere near there? I think the answer to that's no. So there are some team profiles that, and I call them almost Jekyll and Hyde personalities that can make things potentially seem that way. For example, I think of a team that's very strong up front, defense, midi, goal, or attack, but they're weak in goal. And so when they play teams of similar caliber, the front 9 does their job. The goalie doesn't face very many tough shots, and they may even kind of beat up on those teams at times. And then, when they play those stronger teams, they look a lot worse because their goalie can't hold his own at times. And to me, that's more of a Jekyll and Hyde personality, a team personality that can have, some impact versus a gaming of the system, if that makes sense.
Yep.
In hockey, teams often have 2 goalies, so you have the starter and the backup. And at times, you'll see a team with a rating of 88, but when they have their starter in net, they're a 90. When they have their backup in net, they're an 86. And so that 88 really isn't accurate for either of their personalities, but that's the average of them, if that makes sense.
And so, what I would say with that is that, and I've been telling all the coaches that LaxNumbers, what I love about it is that it truly exposes who you are that season. So if you do miss those starting goalies for those 3 games, like that's part of your season, and the LaxNumbers will represent that at the end. And again, I use the word expose, like you can't hide from your LaxNumber because you still have to produce against good teams and you still have to beat the really bad teams by a good margin, right?